Well, LSU with a big time transfer portal signing in Sevyn Banks, a cornerback out of Ohio State. What exactly can he bring to this team? And what did Brian Kelly say after open practice on Saturday that can kind of lead me to believe that in the future, we may not be seeing very many transfer portals in the purple and gold? All of that and more on today's edition of Locked On LSU.
You are Locked On LSU, your daily podcast on the LSU Tigers. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Thank you for making Locked On LSU your first listen every day. We are free and available wherever you get your podcasts. A little bit about me. If you're new here, my name is Caroline Fenton and I'm your host, as I am every single day. I graduated from LSU and I'm a diehard LSU fan, all things LSU, and I'm now a sports talk radio host in Nashville, Tennessee on ESPN 1025 The Game. You can follow me on Twitter at Caroline Fenton1. I'll post my sports takes, updates around whatever I'm covering. You can also follow Locked On LSU on Twitter at Locked On LSU. I'll post podcast updates, links to the episodes. You can also subscribe to us on YouTube, so you can listen to the podcast, whether that's on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. If you're out and about and you want to listen to it, totally do that there. But if you're just hanging out, if you want to throw the podcast on your TV, if you want to watch the podcast, you can do that on YouTube. So be sure to subscribe to our YouTube page, Locked On LSU, and you'll get notified as soon as the podcast drop. Like I mentioned, Sevyn Banks officially making his transfer to LSU, and I believe it was maybe last week or maybe possibly 2 weeks ago on Mailbag Wednesday. I had someone ask, what are some transfers or potential transfers that LSU has been eyeing that you think could be, could contribute to this team, and Sevyn Banks was actually one of them that I listed. Cornerback position was a position of need for LSU, and that was a player that's kind of been in line behind a lot of really impressive corners in college football in the past. So Sevyn Banks officially part of the LSU class of 2022. But who is Sevyn Banks? What is LSU getting out of their new cornerback? First and foremost, a corner out of Ohio State. Finished up his junior year, and there were kind of grumblings about Sevyn Banks potentially declaring for the NFL draft, but he's been riddled with injury. He's going to declare for the NFL draft this past year. He's been dealing with a bunch of different injuries and knee injury. Most recently, limited his production. He missed the last 3 games of this past season and just hasn't really been able to emerge through this Ohio State cornerback room, both because of injury and because of who he's been behind. I mean, he has 36 games, 15 starts throughout his career at Ohio State, and in those 36 games has recorded 43 tackles, 13 passes defended, and 2 interceptions. So I don't think those are necessarily stats. I don't think that's necessarily experience and production that is going to, blow you away, that doesn't blow your socks off. But if you look at who he's been behind throughout his time at Ohio State, you're looking at Jeff Okudah, who was a first-round draft pick. You're looking at Damon Arnette, who was also a first-round draft pick the year before. You're looking at Kendall Sheffield, who took a little bit later in the 2019 drafts, taken in the 4th round. But, Sevyn Banks has been behind some really elite talent. Ohio State produces great cornerbacks. Look at Marshawn Lattimore, for example. All of you Saints fans will be familiar with that name. So Sevyn Banks not only being behind, first round draft pick talent, but also just injury had been holding him back. But not only was Sevyn Banks, looking, I guess, for a fresh start, but he landed in a place at LSU that has been in dire need of cornerback help. Pre-Sevyn Banks' transfer, and you're looking at LSU's cornerback room, and it's completely constructed. It's like a little macaroni, mac-crochet, whatever it is, necklace that you construct in a kindergarten art room that's just been, squeezed together with paper clips and gum. 2 transfers, one out of UL, Junior Mekhi Garner, and another junior out of Oklahoma State, and Jared Bernard Converse. But Bernard Converse fractured his foot. in practice. So he will be out. He will miss some time. It'll take him some time to rehab that foot and get back to 100%. And the rest of the cornerback room, two freshmen coming into their first year of college football. Safety Greg Brooks, who's another transfer out of Arkansas. I mean, coming in as a safety, but said, I can take snaps at outside corner if need be. So really, you're looking at players with limited experience. You're looking at one player out of UL who has experience as a junior, Mekhi Garner, but you're going to need more depth at that cornerback position. So Sevyn Banks coming in, being able to add more depth, and not just depth, but experience, I think will be so huge for this cornerback room. So, I mean, I go back, a really important addition to this cornerback room, and I go back to a comment that Brian Kelly had made a couple weeks ago after practice. There was a question asked, is there a certain position group that has really blown you away? And Brian Kelly said the cornerback position group has been a position that he's been impressed with, a position group that he's been impressed with, not because of their production and not because of the depth, but because he had such low expectations, honestly. And they had been a little bit more consistent than any other position group out there. So Sevyn Banks is also joining a cornerback room, albeit incredibly shallow. One cornerback room that has been able to show signs of development and signs of early production. But this cornerback room still has work to do. It's incredibly shallow. Of course, getting Jerk Bernard Converse back from injury, back from that fractured foot, is going to be so incredibly important. But adding Sevyn Banks, an experienced player at a top program in college football, is going to be huge. Also, to develop some of these younger freshmen in the cornerback room to, have someone to learn from and, just to have more depth. That's really what I think this, the theme of this season is add depth where you need it, add experience where you need it. And that's exactly what they did in adding Sevyn Banks. But I think that this is incredibly interesting because Sevyn Banks will be the 15th transfer in this 2022 class. 2 more spots available in the transfer portal class, but 15 transfers, making the 15th Sevyn Banks. That's the most in the country. Out of any school, which, makes sense, changing of the guards, bringing a new coach in. But there was something that Brian Kelly said on Saturday that kind of light bulb went off in my head when I heard it, that I found the fact that LSU has more transfers than any other team in college football, I found this very interesting. I want to share that with y'all coming up next, but before we do that, I want to tell y'all about BetOnline, because BetOnline.net is your number one source for all of your betting stats and sports information. You can find all of the latest sports developments, league reviews, and news, including this year's basketball playoffs and the start of the Major League Baseball season. But the basketball playoffs have been so incredibly exciting to watch. The Memphis Grizzlies have been electric, and when the Suns and the Pels played on Tuesday night, I have someone who I love very dearly who is a diehard Suns fan, and he was saying, the Suns are going to win. They're going to mop the floor with him. I think Max Kellerman even said it, like it'll be done after the first quarter. But I said, no, I believe in those New Orleans Pelicans, and I put some money on it on betonline.net. And you know what? It paid off. So I showed them. But I use betonline.net, and so can you. So head to their website today or use your mobile device to learn more about the trends in action. They've got sports wagering information. They've got live betting. They've got playoffs. They've got esports. They've got all kinds of things. So give it a shot. BetOnline, where the game starts. Thank you for making Locked On LSU your first listen every day. Now, a big announcement now that it is NFL draft season. Starting Thursday, April 28th, you can turn into Locked On NFL Draft's live coverage of the 2022 NFL Draft with all 3 days. They've got real-time analysis. They've got extensive lineup of experts and insiders. That will be on the Locked On NFL Draft YouTube page. You can check that out on April 28th, starting at 6 p.m. Eastern. The next day, April 29th at 6:30 p.m. Eastern, and April 30th at 11:30 a.m. Eastern. But I know that there are so many of y'all who are dying to know who your team is going to take. And if you need a little bit more NFL Draft information, you can catch Odyssey and Locked On NFL Mock Draft Special hosted by Brian Peacock and former scout Matt Williamson of the Peacock and Williamson NFL Show all week long leading up to the first pick. You can catch that on Odyssey and Locked On NFL Draft podcast feeds on April 18th through the 22nd, as well as April 25th. So make sure to give that a listen as well. LSU adding Sevyn Banks, cornerback out of Ohio State, into this transfer portal class, now sitting at 15 transfers so far on the year. Now, they have 2 more spots available. Brian Kelly has mentioned that they need more depth at the offensive line position. They need more tight end depth. Of course, adding in Nick Storrs doesn't hurt at all, but that's not going to be your long-term solution at the tight end position. Of course, getting him back, like I mentioned, experience and depth are 2 of the most important things to add on to this team that has been so riddled with transfer portal exits. But they still need more tight end depth, especially with a head coach and an offensive coordinator and Mike Denbrock that love to use that tight end. So you can see offensive line, tight end, even running back filling up those 2 final transfer portal spots. But LSU having the most transfers in the country this season, I think is wild, but like when you think about it, it really makes sense. I mean, there's been a seismic shift in this LSU football team. It's a new head coach, a completely new coaching staff. It's a new philosophy. It's a completely different team. So that doesn't surprise me that you're going to add in a lot of transfers because you had a lot of players leave. But when Brian Kelly spoke with the media following the open practice on Saturday, he was asked about the changing of college football, how there have been several coaches coming out either speaking against or for both NIL and transfer portal. And that's what I want to touch on next, is Brian Kelly's comments on NIL. But he said something about the transfer portal that really kind of set off an alarm bell in my head. Now, we're new to Brian Kelly. We're still kind of learning how he is, how he communicates. But I think that I may be looking into it a little bit too much. But I want to break down my thoughts on what he had to say. It's a little bit lengthy, so stay with me, bear with me, but I want to break down what Brian Kelly had to say when he was asked about the transfer portal.
The transfer portal is going to take care of itself. I think naturally, people are starting to get a sense that maybe there needs to be some dead periods, with the transfer portal, that it need not be open 365 days out of the year. I think the SEC has already shown that there could be a time where you close it down. And so I think that is going to eventually find itself to be reasonable. And so I don't know that I need to be standing on a pulpit for that in particular. And I think the transfer portal, look, some coaches are staying away from the transfer portal because they're worried about what the influence is in their program. And I get that. And, I think if you're not doing a really good job of bringing the right people in your program, the transfer portal can be deadly to your program. But, we had some strict parameters in terms of who we were bringing in, and I feel very comfortable with it. There might be some years that I don't use it at all because we're using it all on freshmen. So I don't think I have any declarative statements on it other than they're real, and I want to be able to use those to build the best program that we have.
Okay, so I believe that was a very calculated and smart answer from Brian Kelly because he didn't necessarily put a flag in any sort of territory for or against the transfer portal. But I think there were a few clues that he put out there that made me think he doesn't like the transfer portal. That made me think that in the future, once Brian Kelly gets his feet underneath him, once they have a record to show for itself, hopefully, fingers crossed. And once he starts to get used to the recruiting trail in the Southeast in the state of Louisiana, I got big time vibes that he does not like the transfer portal. First and foremost, he starts talking about, some people are saying that there should be dead periods within the transfer portal, which made me think, I think that there should be dead periods, but I'm not going to say that I think that because I've built up such a big part of my roster this year, and this team has been so dependent on the transfer portal, rightfully so. That's not a dig, it's just the truth, that I don't want to speak out against it. But, the SEC has already mentioned that they may be going that way, and I don't necessarily disagree with him because I do think that they're both in NIL and the transfer portal, we're living in the world of the wild, wild west. And I don't think that we're too far away from a little bit more regulation for both of those things. But Brian Kelly saying, well, some people are saying that there should be dead periods in transfer portal, made me think, and in saying like, I don't think we're far away from that. It made me think, I can't wait until there's a dead period in the transfer portal. He said, I think that's reasonable. And I don't disagree with him. But I think we got a little bit of a peek behind the curtain of exactly how he feels like that. He also said that there have been a lot of coaches concerned about the influences in their program, bringing in players from other programs, which sounds like I'm afraid of bringing in bad influences from other programs. It's a legitimate fear because whenever you, let's say you are a manager for an office, the last thing that you want to do is hire someone who is coming maybe from a competitor or coming from a different job and have them come in and try and shake everything up that you all, like the culture that you've already established or the day-to-day processes that you've already established. Because the last thing you want is for someone to come in who, one, doesn't understand your office culture, someone who says, well, this is the way that I used to do it at my old company. And in your head, you're thinking, okay, well, that's great, but that's not how we do it here. I think that's what Brian Kelly is alluding to. That you're bringing in someone, let's say hypothetically from Auburn, hypothetically speaking, and he says, well, this is the way we did things. This is the way that I acted in my locker room. This is the way that, X, Y, Z, this is how we did things. And I think Brian Kelly saying, well, I've heard that some people are concerned about bringing in bad influences into their program. I think that's Brian Kelly's way of saying, I am concerned that once I have this culture established in this locker room, that once I have my feet under me and that this is very much so my program, I'm afraid about bringing in players from other programs that could potentially be, I think he uses the word bad influences, but I think of it more as, outside voices that could potentially disrupt a culture and an underlying foundation that's been set with his team and this locker room. And he even says, like, there may be some years that I don't use it at all. He's saying that before game one has even kicked off. He's telling us, I don't plan on using the transfer portal as much as I have this year. Now, why does that matter? It matters to me because I fully believe that you in this day and age in college football, you cannot win games. You can win games. You can't win championships without using two recruiting tools. Recruiting kids out of high school and using the transfer portal. I think that we know that as LSU fans all too well, that the reason why LSU got a national championship is largely because of the quarterback that they got in the transfer portal. Now, of course, Joe Burrow is the exception and is not the rule, but I look at Jameson Williams at Alabama, for example. He transferred into Alabama, and he played such a huge role in that Alabama team. So there are going to be really good players that decide to leave their program for whatever reason. And if Brian Kelly is telling us now that he didn't say it outright, but I'm interpreting his words, and maybe that's not fair, but the way that I interpret it is he doesn't like the transfer portal. And that concerns me because I don't think that you can be a top program in the country if you don't open up your program or you're not completely open to the transfer portal. Now, we'll take a look at it and see. I do have to give Brian Kelly kudos for even though it does sound like he really doesn't like using it, he used it this year because he understood that was what they needed to do. That's what LSU needed to do to be competitive, or else this team would have just been full of freshmen. So I have to give him kudos for that. Clearly sounds like he doesn't like the transfer portal, and he's utilizing it this year. But I think that once and if Brian Kelly and this LSU football program get to a point where they've built what they need to build through recruiting, we might not see as many transfers. But Sevyn Banks coming in this year, several transfers coming in this year that could make an immediate impact. And I do wonder, could that change Brian Kelly's mind? We will keep an eye on that. But coming up next, transfer portal is one of the massive seismic changes in college football. But NIL is another big change that a lot of other coaches in college football have publicly spoken out against. I want to break down what Brian Kelly had to say about NIL as well. We've got a few messages from our sponsors, but we'll get into that on the other side. Well, thank you for making Locked On LSU your first listen every day. I want to say maybe last week or maybe 2 weeks ago. Time flies. I broke down some comments that Dabo Swinney had to say about both NIL and the transfer portal, but I want to focus in on his comments about NIL, and that was essentially that he thought it was ruining college football. He thought it was unsustainable. And let's backtrack to maybe a couple of years ago when Dabo Swinney said, whatever players in college football can get paid, that's when I'll leave. And so we were all kind of looking like, all right, Dabo, players are getting paid now. When are you getting the heck out of this sport? But he's been very publicly, kind of against players getting paid. Nick Saban even commented on the changes in college football, calling it unrecognizable, calling it unsustainable. Lane Kiffin has spoken out about how he thinks that there should be some regulation in how the fact that Texas A&M's sitting on an oil field and they can hand out their millions to whatever recruits they want. Like it or not, this is the new era of college football. Are we looking at some sort of regulation in the future? Maybe, potentially. The Supreme Court has already ruled that you cannot have a cap, and that is unconstitutional. So we're not looking at that. We could look at some other sort of regulation in NIL. But Nick Saban, Dabo Swinney, Lane Kiffin, those are two of those three coaches one of those coaches is one of the most decorated coaches in college football. The other one has found a ton of recent success. The third is one of the most recognizable and iconic. I don't know, iconic is not the right word. Notorious, maybe is the better word. Coaches in college football, but either way, three respected and recognized coaches in college football have come out about maybe not necessarily being anti-NIL, but recognizing that we are living in the wild, wild west in terms of NIL. And Brian Kelly was asked about it. And this is what Brian Kelly had to say about the current state of college football that we're in.
Yeah, I live in the moment, and so name, image, and likeness is with us. And so I've spent most of my time, focusing on putting together the most comprehensive and what I would consider attractive name, image, and likeness program for our student athletes here that can compete with anybody in the country instead of worrying about what's wrong with it and what we can do to fix it. I'm not getting too far in front of ourselves, trying to operate within where we are and moving forward that way. And that, look, if I'm going to worry about all the other issues, then I think it's going to take away from the kind of name, image, and likeness program that we need to have here at LSU.
Bravo. Bravo. Thank you, Brian Kelly. First and foremost, I don't know if there's any How I Met Your Mother fans out there, but when he says, I'm living in the moment, I think about like that clip whenever they're like, oh, my parents live in Ohio, and he's like, I just live in the moment. Anyway, just thought that was funny. Anyways, bravo. Thank you, Brian Kelly, because I look at Nick Saban and Dabo just, talking about how they think that NIL is unsustainable. Dabo clearly does not like it. Dabo has been much more anti-NIL than Nick Saban has been. But I look at that like, okay, if I'm a recruit, I'm a junior, senior in high school, and there's Texas A&M offering me $4 million a year to come play football. Nico Amalavea, a quarterback who just committed to Tennessee, just signed on for $8 million throughout his 4 years at Tennessee. So if I'm a high school recruit, that's where I'm going, to a school that fully embraces NIL. I'm not going to Clemson if my head coach has said that he doesn't want the players to make money. So thank you, Brian Kelly. Thank you for saying what needed to be said. That they're doing whatever they can to make sure that their student athletes have what they need to be able to capitalize off of NIL. Because why fight it when it seems inevitable? Like, save up your energy and use it recruiting and coaching and going out there and doing what your job is. So I think that a lot of coaches have been have really put themselves at a disservice, making their jobs harder than it needs to be by being anti-NIL, when really, it's changing things. And yes, it's making recruiting much more difficult. And yes, you have this completely new element of college football that makes it that much more competitive and that much more crazy, but it's not going anywhere. So you can either embrace it or you can say, no, this sucks. And then you can turn recruits away because of your refusal to accept NIL. So I was really happy with the way that Brian Kelly answered that question. He's not saying he loves it. He's not saying he's obsessed with it, but he's saying, why would I be against it when that's just going to suck my energy out where I really need to put my energy, and that is making this football team the best that it can possibly be, and giving these football players the resources that they need in order to capitalize off of NIL. So I was really pleased to hear that was his perspective on NIL. That is going to do it for me today. Coming up tomorrow, we'll have a breakdown of LSU baseball's midweek win over ULM and other spring practice updates as well as the Mailbag Wednesday. I'll get to all of your questions that you've sent in via Twitter. We'll get into that on tomorrow's episode. But thank you for making Locked On LSU your first listen every day. Now make your second listen Locked On NFL Draft, where Ryan Tracy and former NFL cornerback Eric Crocker bring the NFL Draft to life every day with insight and analysis on college football prospects and NFL front offices. It is free and available wherever you get your podcasts.